The cutting wind of the early morning blew through the stone streets, carrying the scent of rain and gasoline. Beneath the dim flicker of a street lamp, Lucas curled up in a corner between two rusted dumpsters. His thin arms wrapped around his knees in an instinctive attempt to contain the cold biting his skin. His stomach growled in silent protest, but he had long learned to ignore hunger. It was a familiar pain, a constant companion he had carried for as long as he could remember. The city remained indifferent. The few cars that passed sped toward warm, safe destinations. No one looked at the dark corners where children like him struggled to survive. To the world, they were invisible. Lucas was 13, but his dirty, marked face looked older. Time on the streets had taught him to be cautious, to hide, and, above all, never to show weakness. Still, that night, something in his chest felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the distant memory of a home he could barely call his own, or the void left by a mother who promised to return but never did. He pulled the worn hood over his head and looked across the street, where a familiar figure emerged through the fog. Júlia. At 12 years old, with a courage that defied her small frame, Júlia was the closest thing Lucas had to family. She crossed the street quickly, holding a plastic bag in her hands. Her disheveled hair fell over her thin shoulders, but the determined sparkle in her brown eyes remained intact. "I found some bread," she said, crouching next to him and offering the bag. They were about to throw it away. Lucas took one of the hard pieces of bread and bit into it carefully. It wasn't much, but at least it would ease the hunger for a few hours. "Thanks," he murmured, breaking the bread in half to share it with her. For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of a train passing over the track. That was how they survived, one day at a time, sharing what little they had and looking out for each other the best they could. "Have you seen Rafa?" Lucas asked, worry creeping into his voice. The third member of their small group had always been more impulsive, and any prolonged absence set off alarms in his mind. "Not since the afternoon. He said he was going to try his luck near the market." Júlia frowned. "I hope he didn't get into trouble." Before Lucas could respond, a distant scream pierced the night. The two exchanged glances, tension rising between them like a wave about to break. They knew that sound, and what it meant. "Come on," Lucas said, jumping to his feet. "We need to find Rafa." The alley behind the market was a maze of empty boxes and piles of trash. Lucas and Júlia moved carefully, keeping to the shadows. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained calm. He couldn't afford to let fear take over. They found Rafa cornered by two older boys, notorious for terrorizing the street kids. The taller one, a boy with cold eyes, gripped the collar of Rafa's shirt as he struggled in vain. "What did you steal from here, huh?" The aggressor's voice was rough, dripping with menace. Lucas didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he grabbed a piece of wood from the ground and stepped forward. "Let him go," he shouted, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. The older boys turned, startled by the intervention. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Júlia was already by Rafa's side, pulling him away while Lucas held his ground. The older boys exchanged a glance, sizing up the situation. Then, with one last look of disdain, they released Rafa and melted into the shadows. Lucas exhaled deeply, trying to steady the hammering of his heart. "You okay?" he asked, looking at Rafa, who was rubbing his neck.
"Yeah."
"Thanks." Gratitude filled his voice, but something in his restless eyes suggested the night was far from over. As they left the alley, the cold felt even sharper. But despite the fear and exhaustion, Lucas felt a spark ignite within him, a silent promise that, somehow, they would find a way out. They wouldn't be swallowed by the darkness. Not yet. As they walked through the dimly lit streets, Lucas, Júlia, and Rafa remained silent. The relief of escaping danger still pulsed in their bodies, but the tension clung to the air like a cold fog. The night seemed even crueler, its icy fingers reaching through their thin clothes, seeping into their tired bone. Lucas led the way, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Years of surviving on the streets had made him cautious. One wrong move could mean the difference between life and disappearing forever. "They'll come back," Rafa muttered, breaking the silence. His voice trembled slightly, but beneath the fear, there was something else, anger. Júlia glanced at Lucas, her expression tense, waiting for his answer, his reassurance. "Not if we stay ahead of them," Lucas replied, his voice steady. "But we need to find a place to sleep. I won't let them catch us off guard again." They turned a corner and moved toward an abandoned building, a temporary refuge they had used before. It was dirty and cluttered with broken furniture, but at least it offered shelter from the wind and the watchful eyes of the city. Yet as they walked, a chill crept up Lucas's spine, a feeling he couldn't shake. They weren't alone. High above them, perched on the edge of a half-demolished building, a figure stood still in the shadows. A long, dark coat clung to his frame, and a hood concealed most of his face. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, followed the trio's every step. This wasn't the first time he had seen these kids. For weeks, he had watched them, three fragile figures navigating the cruel streets, sharing scraps, and protecting each other. But tonight, something was different. Lucas's defiance in the alley had caught his attention. The boy didn't hesitate to put himself in danger. There was a fire inside him that refused to burn out. Interesting, the man murmured under his breath before disappearing back into the darkness. At the abandoned building, Lucas carefully pushed open the rusted door. The sound of the creaking metal echoed through the empty space, but inside, everything seemed quiet. For now, Júlia dropped into a corner, hugging her knees to her chest. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but her eyes remained alert, sleeping too deeply was a luxury none of them could afford. Rafa paced back and forth, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "We can't keep living like this," he blurted out. "I'm sick of being scared, of being hungry, of feeling invisible." Lucas, leaning against the wall, knew Rafa wasn't wrong. But there were no easy answers, not here. "I know," he admitted quietly, "but running without a plan will only get us hurt. Or worse." Júlia lifted her head. Maybe we could ask for help. There are those shelters for kids like us." Lucas shook his head immediately. "I've been to one," he said, bitterness creeping into his voice. "They treat you like a problem to be handled. And if no one wants you, you're just stuck there, forgotten." The silence that followed was heavy. Then, a sound outside. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Lucas stood up instantly, motioning for the others to stay quiet. Every muscle in his body tensed. If it was those older boys again, he wouldn't let them hurt Rafa or Júlia. Not tonight. The door creaked open. A tall, hooded figure stepped inside. "Who's there?" Lucas demanded, his heart thundering in his chest. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a single step forward, allowing the dim light to reveal a face hardened by time and experience. But his eyes, they held no threat, only curiosity. "Relax, kid," the man said, his voice low and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Lucas didn't lower his guard. "Then, what do you want?" The man tilted his head slightly, as though measuring the boy's resolve. "I want to know why 3 kids are fighting to survive alone, and why a kid like you still hasn't given up." His words cut deeper than Lucas expected. Why hadn't he given up? Why did he keep fighting in a world that refused to care? "Because I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone decide where I belong," Lucas answered, his voice steadier than he felt. The man studied him quietly before stepping closer, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I can help with that." Júlia and Rafa exchanged wary glances, but something about the stranger made Lucas hesitate. There was no menace in his tone, only a quiet, unspoken understanding. "Why would you care?" Lucas asked, narrowing his eyes. The man sighed, a sound heavy with memories. "Because a long time ago, I was just like you." And with those words, he extended his hand, offering them a path that would change their lives forever. The air inside the abandoned building grew heavier after the mysterious man's words. His offer lingered in the space between them, dangerous, uncertain. On the streets, trusting someone was a risk that could cost everything. The man kept his hand extended, unmoving. His face, partially lit by a faint beam of moonlight through a broken window, bore faint scars, remnants of a past he hadn't shared. But his eyes were steady, as if used to seeing beyond appearances. "Why should we trust you?" Lucas asked, crossing his arms, his voice sharp despite the uncertainty stirring inside him. The man slowly lowered his hand but did not step back. His expression remained calm, almost patient. "You don't have a reason to trust me," he admitted. "But maybe you have a reason to want out of this life, and I can give you that chance." Júlia, always the most observant, took a step closer. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the stranger carefully. "Who are you?" Her voice was quiet but firm. The man hesitated for a heartbeat before answering. "They call me Miguel," he said, as if choosing his words carefully. "I was where you are now. I know what it's like to fight just to survive, but someone helped me when I needed it most. I'm just trying to do the same." Lucas wasn't convinced. Life on the streets had taught him a harsh truth. No one gives without wanting something in return. And what do you get out of it? Lucas's voice was edged with suspicion. A faint, tired smile touched Miguel's lips, like he'd heard the question before. "Maybe I'm just tired of watching kids get swallowed by the streets," he said softly, a shadow crossing his face. For the first time, Rafa spoke. His voice was small, hesitant. Do you have food? Without answering, Miguel knelt and pulled a worn leather backpack from his shoulders. Slowly, deliberately, he unzipped it and took out a package of bread and a few pieces of fruit. The smell of fresh bread hit them like a wave. Júlia swallowed hard, her stomach twisting with hunger. Without waiting for permission, Rafa grabbed one of the loaves and took a quick bite. Lucas didn't move. This doesn't prove anything, he said, though the ache in his stomach gnawed at him. Guys like you don't show up for no reason. Miguel sighed softly and packed the rest of the food away. You're smart to be careful, he said, his voice carrying a trace of respect. But here's the truth. I know a place where you'll have a real chance. A safe place. But it's your choice. He turned toward the door, his boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. Tomorrow at sunrise, Miguel added. I'll be at the old warehouse near the train tracks. If you want a way out, meet me there. If not, good luck. Without another word, he vanished into the night. For a few moments, silence filled the room. Only the distant hum of the city filled the void Miguel left behind. We can't trust him, Lucas said at last, his voice tight. What if it's a trap? What if it's worse? And what if it isn't? Júlia countered, her eyes filled with a fragile hope. Lucas, we can't do this much longer. You know that. Rafa, still eating, nodded eagerly. At least he has food, he argued. I'm tired of being hungry. Lucas breathed deeply, the weight of responsibility pressing harder on his shoulders. Ever since they became a group, he had taken it upon himself to protect them, even when the choices were impossible. He looked at his friends. Júlia, with her quiet resilience. Rafa, still clinging to an innocence the streets hadn't stolen. If he were alone, he'd never consider trusting Miguel. But they weren't alone, and that changed everything. We'll go, Lucas finally said. But if anything feels wrong, we leave. Fast. The night stretched on, but sleep didn't come for Lucas. He sat awake in the cold silence, listening to the soft breathing of his friends, while thoughts churned restlessly through his mind. Who was Miguel? Why would anyone like him care about 3 forgotten kids? And, most importantly, what if he was lying? By the time the first pale light of dawn crept across the sky, Lucas had made his decision. It wasn't just fear driving him, it was something deeper, a spark of hope. At the break of dawn, the 3 of them left the abandoned building and made their way toward the train track. The city was quiet in the early morning haze, but the weight of the unknown grew heavier with each step. The old warehouse stood like a giant relic beside the rusty railway. Its metal doors were worn with age, its broken windows jagged like teeth. Lucas hesitated in front of the entrance, his heart pounding. If something goes wrong, Júlia began, her voice a whisper. I'll handle it, Lucas said firmly. They stepped inside, and there he was. Miguel sat on an old wooden crate, watching them with that same unreadable calm. You came, he said, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Good. Because your journey is just beginning. And with those words, the fate of the 3 friends would change forever. The air inside the warehouse was heavy and damp, thick with the scent of rust and old wood. Lucas, Júlia, and Rafa stood frozen for a moment, as if stepping through that door had pulled them into something they couldn't escape. Miguel remained seated on a wooden crate, his posture relaxed, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. Are you hungry? He asked, breaking the silence. Lucas hesitated, still wary, but Júlia and Rafa, worn down by days without a proper meal, nodded almost simultaneously. Miguel reached into his leather backpack, pulling out a pack of biscuits, some apples, and a bottle of water. He placed them on a rusty metal table nearby. Eat, he said quietly. I'm not here to hurt you. Júlia was the first to move. She grabbed one of the biscuits cautiously, her hunger overcoming her caution. Lucas, however, stayed back, watching Miguel's every move, searching for hidden intentions. Why are you doing this? Lucas asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Miguel leaned back slightly, as if he had expected that question. Because I know what it feels like to have no one, he answered, his voice softer than before. And sometimes, all you need is for someone to treat you like you matter. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Lucas felt something stir inside him, a memory of a time before the streets, when he still believed someone might come back for him, but he pushed it away. He couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. And this safe place you mentioned, Lucas continued, his tone still guarded. Where is it? Miguel studied him for a moment before replying. It's a community shelter, he explained. A few blocks from here. It's not perfect, but you'll get food, clean clothes, and a warm bed. Lucas let out a dry, humorless laugh. I've heard that story before, he said. Those places are just cages. If no one wants you, you rot there until you turn 18. A flicker of something, sadness, maybe, passed through Miguel's face, but he didn't deny it. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said finally. "The system isn't fair, but I'm offering you a choice. You can stay on the streets, running and starving, or you can come with me and try something different." "And if we don't like it?" Júlia asked, her voice softer than Lucas's, but no, less serious. "Then you leave," Miguel promised. "No one will keep you there against your will." The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. Lucas felt it pressing on his chest. His instincts told him not to trust anyone, but the truth was, they were running out of options. He glanced at Júlia and Rafa, too thin, too tired. He couldn't let them waste away. "Not like this." "We'll go," he said at last. "But if something feels wrong, we're out." A flicker of approval crossed Miguel's face. "Fair enough," he said, rising to his feet. "Let's go before anyone notices we're here." The city felt different at dawn. The streets, once dangerous under the cover of night, seemed eerily quiet in the pale morning light. Streetlights flickered off as the first rays of the sun touched the cracked pavement. Miguel led the way with confident steps, occasionally glancing back to make sure the three kids kept up. Lucas walked just behind him, his senses sharp, ready for any sign of trouble. Years of surviving alone had taught him one thing: never let your guard down. Júlia walked in silence, lost in thought. Rafa, however, stole glances at the food Miguel had given them, holding the last biscuit tightly in his hand as if it were a treasure. "We're almost there," Miguel announced as he turned onto a quieter, narrower street. Lucas's instincts flared. Something felt wrong. A shiver crept up his spine, and then, he saw it. A tall man stood across the street, leaning casually against a graffiti-covered wall. Dressed in black, with a worn cap pulled low over his face, his presence felt too still, too deliberate. "Miguel," Lucas's voice dropped to a whisper, his muscles tensing. Miguel stopped mid-step. His face hardened the moment his eyes fell on the stranger. "Run," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. Lucas didn't hesitate. He grabbed Júlia's hand and pulled Rafa forward. Together, they bolted down the narrow street, weaving between trash cans and abandoned cars. Behind them, heavy footsteps echoed as the stranger gave chase. "This way." Miguel veered into an alley on the left, his voice steady despite the danger. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as they ran, his lungs burning with effort. But he didn't slow down, not until Miguel led them to a rusted metal door tucked behind a crumbling building. With swift, practiced movements, Miguel pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. "Inside, now." Lucas shoved Júlia and Rafa through the opening before turning to Miguel. "Who was that guy?" he demanded, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Miguel locked the door behind them, his hands steady despite the tension in his jaw. "Someone who doesn't want you to have a second chance," he said darkly. "And if he knows you're with me, things are going to get a lot more complicated." A chill ran through Lucas. "What aren't you telling us?" Miguel met his gaze, and for the first time, Lucas saw something other than calm in his expression, a flicker of fear. "Because sometimes," Miguel said quietly, "the people who are supposed to help you are the same ones who want to keep you trapped." The three kids exchanged uneasy glances, and for the first time, Lucas realized that trusting Miguel might not be the end of their problems. It could be the beginning of something far more dangerous. The metal door closed with a dull thud, muffling the sounds of the street. Lucas's heart was still pounding in his chest as his eyes adjusted to the dim light of the new space. It was unlike any place he had ever seen, a mix of an improvised shelter and a workshop. Toolboxes were scattered across the floor, and shelves full of supplies lined the walls. But what caught his attention the most was the large map hanging on the wall, marked with several red circles. "What is this place?" Júlia asked hesitantly. "A refuge," Miguel answered, still facing the door as he reinforced the lock. "It's not the community center, but you're safe here, for now." Lucas narrowed his eyes. Something didn't add up. Miguel spoke like someone who knew more than he was willing to share. "And that guy?" Lucas pressed. "Who was he? Why was he after you? Or us?" Miguel sighed before turning around. The weak light from a ceiling lamp cast deep shadows on his face, highlighting the hard lines of someone who had seen too much. "There are people who profit from kids like you," he began, his voice steady, but filled with bitterness. "Not everyone who claims to help actually wants to." Júlia furrowed her brow, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" Miguel took a few steps toward a wooden table, resting his hands on the worn surface. "Some shelters receive money for every child they register," he explained. "But instead of taking care of you, they pocket the resources. Kids disappear all the time, and no one notices. Because, to the system, you're invisible." Lucas felt a knot tighten in his throat. He knew that feeling too well. How many times had he been in shelters where the looks were cold, and the hands that were supposed to protect became threats? "That guy, is he from one of those places?" Rafa asked softly. "He works for someone who wants to keep things the way they are," Miguel replied, his eyes locked on the trio. And if they find out I'm trying to get you out of this cycle, they'll do whatever it takes to stop us. Lucas crossed his arms, trying to hide, the chill running down his spine. Why are you risking so much for kids like us? He asked, the question coming out harsher than he intended. Miguel fell silent for a moment, as if deciding how much he was willing to reveal. Finally, he rolled up his coat sleeve, exposing a deep scar running along his forearm. Because I was you, Lucas, he said quietly. I lived on the streets, went hungry, and was forgotten until someone saved me. Now, it's my turn to give back. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Júlia, who had been quietly observing, took a step forward. You said you were taking us to a safe place. Why did you bring us here? Miguel turned his gaze to her, a flicker of concern flashing in his eyes. After today, the community center isn't safe anymore. If that guy saw you with me, he'll tell others. That's why you'll stay here for now. Lucas clenched his jaw. He hated feeling trapped, with no control over his own life. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like someone might actually be on their side. How long will we stay here? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Until I find out who's after you, Miguel answered, his tone darker now. But know this, if you go back to the streets now, you won't last long. Night fell over the city, and the warehouse grew even quieter. Rafa had already fallen asleep on an old mattress in the corner. Júlia lay beside him, wide awake, her gaze fixed on the metal ceiling. Lucas, however, couldn't rest. He sat on a pile of crates, elbows resting on his knees, watching Miguel from across the warehouse. The man shuffled through papers and maps, always planning something bigger. Finally, Lucas broke the silence. Have you saved other kids before? Miguel looked up, surprised by the question. After a brief pause, he nodded slowly. Some, he said. Some, I got out in time. Others, I didn't. Lucas felt a pang in his chest. He thought about all the kids he had met, some who had disappeared without a trace. What if someone like Miguel had come for them? Why us? Why me? He pressed, his voice heavy with doubt. Miguel let out a long sigh. Because you have something most people lose, he said. You still believe you can change your story. Those words echoed in Lucas's mind for a long time. When the first light of dawn crept through the small window, Lucas was still awake. A part of him wanted to trust Miguel, another part, bruised and wary, refused to let his guard down. But one thing he knew for sure, if there was even the smallest chance of escaping that life, he had to take it. In the distance, the faint hum of an engine broke the early morning silence. Lucas slowly approached the window, peeking through a narrow gap. A black car was parked across the street, and behind the wheel, the man in the cap was staring directly at the warehouse. Lucas stepped back, his pulse quickening. Miguel, he called, urgency thick in his voice. Miguel was by his side in an instant, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the car. They found us faster than I expected, he muttered. What are we going to do? Lucas asked, adrenaline surging through his veins. Miguel clenched his fists, already working out a plan in his head. We leave before they get in, he said firmly. And from now on, you trust no one. Lucas nodded, realizing that the line between freedom and danger was becoming thinner by the second. And he knew that to survive, he would have to fight harder than ever before. The sound of the engine growling outside echoed through the warehouse, carrying with it an unspoken threat. Lucas's heart raced as he peered through the window at the black car parked across the street. The man in the cap was still there, motionless, his eyes locked on the metal door, like a predator waiting for its prey. They found us, Lucas murmured, not looking away from the window. Miguel was already moving. With impressive speed, he switched off the weak ceiling light and grabbed a backpack hidden beneath the workbench. His movements were quick and precise, like someone who had done this before. Wake Júlia and Rafa, he ordered, his voice low but urgent. We have to leave. Now. Lucas didn't hesitate. He hurried to his friends and shook them gently. Wake up, we have to go, he whispered, trying to keep the fear from creeping into his voice. Júlia blinked sleepily, pushing herself out of the haze of exhaustion. Rafa, still groggy, sat up with a frown. What's going on? He asked, his voice rough. I'll explain later, Lucas answered, pulling him to his feet. By the time Lucas returned, Miguel had already unlocked a side door, a hidden emergency exit concealed behind piles of scrap metal. His face was tense, but his voice remained calm. They can't see us leaving, Miguel warned. Stay low and follow me closely. The three nodded without a word. Miguel cracked the door, open just enough to scan the alley. The car remained on the street, and the man hadn't moved yet. Now, Miguel whispered. The morning air was thick with moisture, wrapping around them as they crept through the narrow gaps between buildings. Lucas felt his pulse pounding in his ears, every step fueled by a mix of fear and adrenaline. Miguel led them through a maze of alleys and side streets. He moved with the certainty of someone who knew every corner of the city. They turned a sharp corner and slipped into a dark corridor, emerging on a quieter back street. Over here, Miguel said, crouching beside a rusted grate. He knelt and lifted the bottom edge with ease. Get inside. Lucas hesitated for only a second. The faint sound of an approaching engine shattered any doubts. He dropped into the tunnel first, followed closely by Júlia and Rafa. Miguel was the last to enter, carefully lowering the grate behind them. The narrow tunnel smelled of damp earth and rust, but Lucas was more concerned with the fact that, for now, they were hidden. Where does this lead? Júlia asked, her voice trembling. Far away from them, Miguel replied from the front, leading them through the darkness. Trust me. Lucas wanted to trust him. He wanted to believe Miguel was genuinely trying to help. But after years of surviving on the streets, Lucas had learned a harsh truth. No one helps without wanting something in return. Minutes passed in silence before the tunnel opened into a concealed exit behind a crumbling brick wall. Outside, an abandoned park stretched before them, overgrown weeds and broken benches scattered across the lot. Miguel emerged first, scanning the area before motioning for the others to follow. We should be safe here for now, he said, exhaling deeply. But we can't stay long. Rafa collapsed onto a bench, still panting. Who are those guys? He asked, frustration lacing his voice. Why are they after us? Miguel knelt down in front of the three, his gaze more serious than ever. They're not after you, he said quietly. They're after what you represent. Lucas's brows furrowed. And what do we represent? The truth, Miguel answered. You're living proof that the system is broken. And the longer you stay free, the harder it is for them to keep their secrets buried. Júlia, ever the rational thinker, pressed further. Why do they care about us? We're just 3 kids. Miguel shook his head slowly. It's not that simple. I've been working to expose a child exploitation network for years. That man in the car? He works for someone powerful, someone who'll do anything to keep their operation hidden. And if they find out I'm helping you, they won't stop until they silence us. Lucas clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his skin. Then we can't stop, he said firmly. Not after everything we've been through. Miguel's lips curved into a faint, proud smile. We won't stop, he promised. But to survive this, you need to be smarter than them. The group lingered in the abandoned park while Miguel planned their next move. When he finally stood, his voice held a new level of resolve. I know a place, one that's truly safe, he said. Not a government shelter. A place where kids like you get the chance to start over. Lucas, still wary, narrowed his eyes. And what happens if they find us again? Miguel stepped closer, his gaze steady. If they find us, he said, we fight together. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A silent promise none of them took lightly. Lucas drew in a deep breath, looking to Júlia and Rafa. They were counting on him. He couldn't let them down. Then let's go, he said, his voice stronger than before. And this time, we won't run. A flicker of pride lit Miguel's expression. You're stronger than you realize, he said quietly. And I'll prove it to you. And with that, they left the park, no longer just frightened kids on the run, but fighters in a quiet battle against a system that had tried to erase them. But deep down, Lucas knew one thing for certain, this fight was only beginning. The sun was already high in the sky as Lucas, Júlia, Rafa, and Miguel crossed a busy avenue, blending into the hurried crowd. Despite the blaring horns and the chaotic movement, Lucas remained alert. Every sharp sound or lingering glance sent a ripple of tension through him. We're almost there, Miguel said, in a tone meant to reassure them. Just a few more blocks. Lucas didn't respond. His mind churned over the events of the last few hours, the chase, Miguel's revelations, and the growing feeling that they were caught in something much bigger than themselves. This place, Júlia finally broke the silence, her voice hesitant. Is it really safe? Miguel nodded, guiding them toward a quieter side street. Safer than any government shelter, he said. This refuge was built by people who know how the system fails. They protect kids like you, the ones the world tries to forget. Lucas frowned, absorbing every word. He wanted to believe him, but life on the streets had taught him a harsh lesson. Safe places often hid the darkest secrets. After a few more minutes of walking, Miguel stopped in front of an old, weathered building that seemed almost invisible amidst the modern structures surrounding it. The facade was covered in graffiti, the windows coated with layers of grime, and a faded sign above the door read, Carvalho Warehouse, closed for renovations. This is it? Rafa asked skeptically. It looks abandoned. Miguel smirked, as if expecting the reaction. Sometimes the safest places, he said, pulling a set of keys from his pocket, are the ones no one notices. He unlocked the rusted side door and pushed it open with a creak. The smell of old wood and oil filled the air as they stepped inside. From the outside, it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten storage space, but inside, it was something else entirely. The narrow hallway opened into a large, well-organized space. Worn mattresses lined the walls, and a sturdy wooden table at the center held half-eaten bread and fresh fruit. A bookshelf, overflowing with tattered books, leaned against the far wall. Scattered throughout the warehouse were children, some younger than Rafa, others older than Lucas. Some played cards, while others read quietly or rested. Soft laughter and murmured conversations filled the room, a striking contrast to the cold, empty nights on the street. "Welcome to the invisible refuge," Miguel announced, closing the door behind them. A woman emerged from a side corridor. She had short, curly hair, wore a simple sweatshirt, and her warm smile reached her eyes. "You're back," she said, addressing Miguel, but her gaze quickly shifted to Lucas, Júlia, and Rafa. "And you brought company. They need a safe place, Marina," Miguel explained, his voice tinged with urgency. Marina scanned the trio carefully, as if trying to gauge the weight of the invisible scars they carried. "They can stay," she said without hesitation. "This is home now." Those words stirred something inside Lucas. He wanted to believe they were true, that, for once, they wouldn't have to keep running. "What are the rules?" Lucas asked, his arms crossed in a defensive stance. "Just 3, Marina said, holding up her fingers. "First, no one here judges you for your past. Second, you help those around you. And third," she smiled, "we never leave anyone behind." Lucas exchanged a glance with Júlia and Rafa. Trusting was hard after everything they had been through, but there was something genuine about Marina and this place. "Seems fair," Júlia said, her voice softer now. The rest of the day passed quietly. Miguel and Marina showed them around the refuge. It had been carefully designed to house up to 20 children, with every inch of space used with purpose, from a small pantry to an improvised study area. But Lucas couldn't relax. Every smile they received, every act of kindness felt too good to be true. While Júlia and Rafa quickly blended with the others, Lucas found Miguel at a workbench repairing a broken flashlight. "How long are we staying here?" Lucas asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Miguel looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Until it's safe for you to leave. Maybe longer," he said, watching Lucas carefully. "Unless you want to go back to the streets." "No," Lucas admitted, tension still evident in his voice. "But I don't want to be trapped in another system either." "This isn't a prison," Miguel assured him. "You can leave anytime you want. But if you stay, I'll teach you how to protect yourself, and how to fight back against the people who want to erase you." There was something different in Miguel's voice, not pity, not charity. It was as if he saw something in Lucas that no one else did. "Why are you doing all this?" Lucas asked, his voice softer than before. Miguel hesitated, as though the answer carried a weight he wasn't sure he wanted to share. "Because I don't want you to be the next victims," he finally said. His voice darkened slightly. "I lost people who didn't get a second chance. I'm not letting that happen again." Lucas nodded slowly. For the first time in a long while, it felt like someone was on their side, and maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the streets. Later that night, while the others slept on scattered mattresses, Lucas remained awake. His thoughts swirled with everything they had been through, and everything still to come. A faint noise from the entrance cut through the quiet. He moved silently toward the side door and peered through a small crack. His heart pounded. The black car was back, and standing beneath the streetlight, his face shadowed by a worn cap, was the same man. They were still being hunted. Lucas clenched his fists, but this time, there was no fear. Only anger. Only resolve. If someone wanted to erase them, they were going to have to fight for it. And now, Lucas wasn't alone anymore. The night was silent, but Lucas felt the weight of something invisible hanging in the air. Through the crack in the side door, he watched the black car parked across the street, the man in the cap standing still. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained cold and alert. They were still being watched. Lucas stepped back slowly, his bare feet barely making a sound against the concrete floor. When he returned to the center of the warehouse, he found Miguel organizing supplies on a nearby shelf. "He's out there," Lucas whispered, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. "The man in the cap. He found us." Miguel froze for a second. His face hardened, but when he spoke, his voice remained calm. "He won't come in," he said, though there was a hint of tension beneath his words. "This place was designed to be invisible. As long as we stay inside, we're safe." "For how long?" Lucas countered, folding his arms across his chest. "They won't stop. will they? Miguel let out a heavy sigh and knelt down, pulling a box from beneath the table. When he opened it, Lucas saw what looked like an old radio, patched together with colorful wires and a faintly blinking light. I have contacts, Miguel explained, adjusting the radio's knobs. People who are fighting the same system that tried to erase you. If they know we've been found, they'll act. Act how? Lucas asked, his stomach twisting with unease. Miguel met his gaze, and for the first time, Lucas saw something new in his eyes. Not just worry, but a fierce, unwavering determination. They'll protect you, but they'll also fight. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to process the weight of those words. He wasn't used to people protecting him. Survival had always depended on his own instincts. And if he finds a way in? Lucas pressed, unwilling to let go of his doubts. Miguel shut the radio off and stood up, placing a firm hand on Lucas's shoulder. If that happens, I won't let them touch you. I promise. The words echoed in Lucas's chest, stirring a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Hours passed, but Lucas couldn't sleep. Every creak, every distant sound from outside made his mind spiral into worst-case scenarios. He got up quietly and walked over to where Júlia and Rafa slept, their peaceful breathing contrasting with the storm raging in his thoughts. I won't let anyone hurt you, he whispered softly to himself. Then, a sharp, metallic noise pierced the silence, like something scraping against the side door. His body tensed. He moved quickly toward Miguel, who was sitting in a chair, half awake but always alert. I heard something at the door, Lucas murmured. Miguel was on his feet instantly, his movements swift and deliberate. He grabbed a metal rod hidden behind the table and walked toward the entrance. Lucas followed, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. When they reached the side door, Miguel signaled for Lucas to stay back. He pressed his ear against the metal surface and listened. The sound came again, a faint, scraping noise, but this time, it was above them. They're looking for another way in, Miguel whispered, his voice tense. Lucas swallowed hard. What do we do? Miguel considered for a moment before answering. We leave before they trap us. In minutes, Miguel had gathered the essentials, backpacks with food, water, and warm blankets. He woke Júlia and Rafa, who rubbed the sleep from their eyes, confusion quickly giving way to fear. They found us, Miguel explained plainly. We need to leave, now. Rafa clung to Júlia's arm, his voice trembling. Are they going to take us? Not while I'm here, Miguel promised. Lucas felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was their only chance to escape, and he wouldn't waste it. Where do we go? Lucas asked, already pulling on his backpack. There's a tunnel at the back, Miguel said. It leads to an abandoned subway station. If we make it there, we can lose them. With one last glance at the warehouse, the only place that had felt safe in years, Miguel led them to a hidden trapdoor near the back wall. Go, he urged, opening the hatch. Lucas climbed down first, helping Júlia and Rafa follow. Miguel was the last to enter, carefully closing the door behind them. The underground tunnel was narrow and damp, the smell of wet earth and rust filling their noses. The only light came from the flashlight in Miguel's hand. Stay close, he warned. If you hear anything, tell me. Lucas kept his senses sharp. Every shadow seemed to move, and his ears strained to catch the faintest sound. Where will we go after the subway? Lucas asked, trying to plan ahead. I have a contact. Outside the city, Miguel replied. If we reach him, you'll finally be safe. A distant metallic sound echoed through the tunnel, making everyone freeze in place. Lucas held his breath, praying it was nothing, but then, the sound came again. Closer. They're here, Júlia whispered, her voice shaking. Miguel quickened his pace. We're almost at the exit. Move. They emerged into the ruins of an abandoned subway station. Rusted tracks stretched before them, graffiti covered the walls, and a faint light flickered near an old staircase. This way. Miguel pointed to the concrete stairs, but before they could reach them, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Someone was following. Lucas turned in time to see the shadowed figure of the man in the cap stepping into the station. Run, Miguel ordered. Without hesitation, Lucas grabbed Rafa's hand and pulled Júlia along as they raced up the stairs. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. At the top, Miguel slammed a rusty gate shut behind them, locking it with a heavy chain. It wouldn't hold for long, but it would buy them time. We made it, Rafa panted, relief flooding his voice. But Lucas knew better. They weren't safe yet. And as long as someone wanted to erase them, they would have to keep fighting. The exit from the abandoned subway station led to an overgrown vacant lot surrounded by old, crumbling buildings. The cold, damp air clung to their skin, but for Lucas, Júlia, Rafa, and Miguel, that chill meant one thing: freedom, at least for now. Lucas's heart still pounded in his chest. The man in the cap had been too close. They didn't have much time. Where to now? Julia asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Miguel scanned the area carefully before answering. My contact lives a few streets from here, he said, his tone steady but urgent. If we make it to him, we'll have a safe place to regroup. Lucas nodded, but unease gnawed at him. Why would anyone go to such lengths to hunt down 3 forgotten kids? Can we trust this contact? He asked, narrowing his eyes. Miguel hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. Yes, he finally said, his voice firmer than before. He's helped other kids escape, but we need to move in now. Without another word, they followed him through the darkened streets. The city felt heavier at night, as though the shadows themselves were watching. Lucas stayed close to Julia and Rafa, every muscle in, his body tense. After nearly 20 minutes of navigating alleys and side streets, Miguel stopped in front of a small brick building. No signs. No lights, just a heavy steel door, worn by time. He knocked 3 times, a sharp, deliberate rhythm. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a thin, gray-haired man with deep lines etched into his face. His sharp eyes flicked over the group before settling on Miguel. You're late, the man said, his voice low and rough. I brought company, Miguel replied, nudging the kids forward. They're being hunted. The man's face darkened as he stepped aside. Get in, quickly. Lucas hesitated for a split second. What if it was a trap? But Miguel's nod reassured him, and he led Julia and Rafa inside. Once the door was locked behind them, the man turned to face the group fully. Do you know who's after you? He asked, his voice heavy with something Lucas couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Lucas exchanged a glance with Julia and Rafa before answering. A man in a cap. But Miguel said there's more. The man, Gustavo, as Miguel had called him, walked to a cluttered desk piled with papers and maps. He shuffled through a worn folder before pulling out a photograph. Is this him? He asked, holding the picture up. Lucas's stomach churned. It was the man. That's him, he confirmed, his voice tight. Gustavo's expression hardened. He lowered the photo, letting out a long, slow breath. If he's involved, it's worse than I thought, he muttered. Lucas's patience snapped. Enough secrets, he demanded. Who are they? Why are they chasing us? Miguel and Gustavo exchanged a look, one that said they knew more than they had told. You know how the foster system works, Miguel began, his voice heavy. Shelters receive funding from the government for each child under their care. But some of them, he paused, jaw tightening, found ways to profit beyond that. What kind of profit? Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Human trafficking, Gustavo answered bluntly. Some kids are erased from official records. No name, no past, no one looking for them. Lucas felt his stomach twist into knots. He had heard rumors on the streets, whispers about kids disappearing, but he had never thought it could be real. They wanted us for that? Rafa's voice trembled as he clung to Julia's arm. Not exactly, Miguel said, his tone grim. You escaped. And now, you're living proof that the system is broken. If the truth gets out, everything those criminals built comes crashing down. A cold shiver ran down Lucas's spine. They weren't just running for their lives, they were a threat to something much bigger. And you? Lucas asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside. Why are you fighting them? Gustavo adjusted his glasses and leaned against the desk. Because I lost people I loved to this system, he said, his voice low but fierce. And I refuse to let it happen again. Silence settled over the room. Lucas felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him, heavy and inescapable. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. So what now? Lucas asked, his resolve hardening. Miguel looked to Gustavo, who gave a slow nod before answering. You have 2 choices, Miguel said. We can get you out of the city, start new lives where no one will ever find you. Or, Gustavo continued, his eyes sharp. You can fight, we expose the truth, and bring this entire operation down. Julia squeezed Rafa's hand, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. They could disappear, escape it all, but what about the other kids still trapped in that system? But Lucas already knew his answer. I'm not running, he said firmly. Not while they're still hurting other kids. A faint, proud smile touched Miguel's lips. I knew you'd say that. Julia drew in a deep breath, finding strength in Lucas's decision. If he stays, I stay. Rafa hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Me too. Gustavo stood up, the fire of purpose burning in his eyes. Then get ready, he said. Because from this moment on, you're not just street kids anymore. You're the proof that no one can be erased. For the first time, Lucas felt something powerful ignite within him. Not just anger, but purpose. He wasn't just surviving now. He was fighting, and he wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed. The sun had not yet risen when Lucas, Julia, and Rafa gathered in the cramped room of Gustavo's hideout. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes just before a storm. They had made their choice. They wouldn't run, they would fight. Lucas sat on a worn wooden bench, watching as Gustavo spread a large map of the city across the table. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes burned with determination. Miguel leaned against the wall, his expression grim, like a soldier preparing for battle. There, closer than we thought, Gustavo said, circling a location on the map. This warehouse here, it's where they keep the kids who disappear from the records. If we get proof, we can destroy the entire operation. Júlia bit her lip, her mind racing as she tried to process the gravity of the situation. How do we get in? She asked. They'll be expecting us. That's where you come in, Miguel said, his gaze falling on Lucas. You know the streets better than anyone. Getting in and out unnoticed is your specialty. Lucas felt a cold knot in his stomach, but his voice was steady. What are we looking for? Gustavo reached into a worn leather folder and pulled out photographs, grainy images of children no one else was searching for. Records, he said firmly. Anything linking this place to the missing kids. If we can prove they're keeping children off the grid, no one can ignore it. Rafa shifted uncomfortably, fear flickering in his eyes. And if they catch us? Miguel stepped forward, his voice low and intense. They won't, he promised, because I'll be there to stop them. Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. But for once, it didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a purpose. Let's do it, he said. That night, the city's darkness felt heavier as Lucas, Júlia, Rafa, and Miguel moved through the shadows. The industrial district was a maze of empty warehouses and rusted fences, but the one they sought loomed ahead, a massive, windowless building marked only by faded lettering. Lucas crouched behind a stack of metal barrels, scanning the perimeter. 2 guards by the main entrance, he whispered. We can slip in through the back. Miguel grinned faintly. Good eye. Lead the way. They crept along the side of the building until they reached a sagging portion of the chain link fence. Lucas pulled it back just enough for them to crawl through. Every breath felt louder in the still night. At a rusted side door, Júlia knelt, pulling a lockpick from her jacket, a tool Miguel had given her earlier. Give me a minute, she murmured. Lucas kept watch while she worked, his heart pounding. You've got this, he whispered. With a soft click, the door opened. We're in, Júlia said, a trace of pride in her voice. Inside, the warehouse was worse than Lucas had imagined. Cold fluorescent lights flickered over rows of locked rooms. A chill ran through him. How many kids had been trapped here? Office should be at the far end, Miguel whispered. Let's move. Lucas and Júlia slipped down a narrow corridor while Rafa stayed close to Miguel. They reached a heavy metal door marked records. Lucas twisted the handle. It wasn't locked. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, and stacks of papers were scattered across a desk. Lucas rifled through the files until a familiar chill crept up his spine. Júlia, look. He held up a folder stamped in bold red letters. Transferred. The pages were filled with names, kids no one had noticed had disappeared. These kids, they never got adopted, Júlia whispered, her face pale. Lucas shoved the files into his backpack. We have what we need, let's go. A sudden noise froze them, footsteps in the hall. Lucas doused the light and pulled Júlia behind a cabinet as the door creaked open. A guard stepped inside, scanning the room. If he found them, it was over. Then, across the warehouse, a loud crash shattered the silence. The guard turned and bolted toward the noise. Miguel, Júlia breathed. He's buying us time. Lucas grabbed her hand. Come on. They met Miguel and Rafa near the exit. Miguel's arm was bleeding, but he held a crowbar in his hand, eyes sharp. Got the evidence? He asked. Lucas patted his bag. Everything. Then run. We're not leaving you. Lucas protested. Miguel smiled, a rare, proud smile. I promise to protect you. Now go. Reluctantly, Lucas pulled Júlia and Rafa with him. They ran, until the warehouse was nothing but a distant shadow. By dawn, Gustavo had delivered the evidence to the media. The headlines exploded, illegal child trafficking network exposed in secret operation. Lucas, Júlia, and Rafa sat in the small hideout, watching the news. For the first time, their fight wasn't in the shadows, the world knew the truth. But Miguel was still missing. Days stretched into a week. Worry gnawed at Lucas. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the hideout door creaked open. Miguel. He was battered and exhausted, but alive and smiling. Told you I'd protect you, he said softly. Lucas ran to him, for once letting his guard down. We did it, Lucas said. Miguel's smile grew. No, kid, you did it. For the first time in years, Lucas felt something new, freedom. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were proof that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, never fades. And now, they were no longer invisible.